Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jessica Devereaux in Baltimore. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has kept one of his main campaign promises. He announced that he plans to withdraw Canada's fighter jets from the U.S.-led coalition bombing Islamic militants in Syria and Iraq. This is a stark contrast from his predecessor, Stephen Harper, who launched Canada into this coalition a year ago. Here to highlight the significance of this move by the Prime Minister is our guest, Sabah Alnasseri. He is a professor of political science at York University in Toronto, Canada. Thanks so much for being with us, Sabah.
Thanks for having me, Jessica.
So let's get right into it, Sabah. Most of what we're hearing from the West is really about more airstrikes. France continued its bombing campaign in Syria after the Paris attack, but Canada is pulling back. Why is this so significant, Sabah?
Well, first, I think to his credit that this is his second promise. The first promise of Minister President Trudeau was to have 50% of his cabinet women, which he did. And I think this is the second promise of his campaign, which he's trying to fulfill. The one he mentioned about withdrawing and, reducing the engagement, the military engagement of Canada in the Middle East. So to his credit, these are two of his, election campaign. Let me start with this. I would say that the security state itself is the reason why there is no security. And let me explain this. Since 9/11, Western state in Europe, United States, and under the Harper government in Canada spent hundreds of billions of dollars in the so-called security states. They, waged war. They undermined civil liberties, restrict movement. There were mass incarceration, suspicion, criminalization of community, and so on. This didn't make Western states more secure, more safe. No, you see, we have this attack, and we have other attacks before in the US and Europe. So I think the security state, through its own policy of insecuritization of the population, make people more vulnerable to extremists than otherwise. And that's why I see it as a significant what President Trudeau is trying to do here is by introducing a shift in Western foreign policy vis-a-vis the conflict in the Middle East, which I hope he will extend also to the conflict in Israel-Palestine and shift the policy of the Harper New Cons government, the unilaterally supporting of Israel, which empowered Israel actually to commit genocide against the Palestinians in the recent, at least two wars in 2014 and 2009. So if Minister Trudeau will pursue such policy, such a shift in foreign policy to a much more peaceful, non-military solution to the conflicts, I think this is significant, not only in the Canadian context, but for two reasons. One, it will act against all this insecuritization introduced by the security state under Harper, namely the collective criminalization and suspicion of Arab and Muslim community in Canada. This made Canada actually more vulnerable to extremists than otherwise. That's why I think Trudeau is pushing back against this.
Okay.
The second significant movement, I would say, since Canada is at least under the Harper government was, involved directly in the so-called war of terror, and introducing now a shift in foreign policy that might give a good example to for other states to follow suit and to seek for peaceful solutions of this conflict rather than betting on more troops, more bombing, more militarization. So I think it's significant for two reasons.
But Sabah, how much is this really a shift? Because at a meeting about the TPP this week, Trudeau said that Canada will keep doing, quote, more than its part to defend against the Islamic State of Iraq, ISIS essentially, but augmenting its contingent of ground troops currently training in Iraq. It's going to be doing that. So how much is Canada really shifting when it comes to its role in the Syrian conflict?
Right. Well, it's too early to say because, at least the last 10 years under the Harper government, there was a kind of common sense that, developed through different kind of policies, migration policies, refugees, security policies, and so on, that created a sense of the vulnerabilities of the Canadian people vis-a-vis extremist attack from outside. Not only from outside, but also suspicion vis-a-vis Canadian Arabs and Muslim, etc. So this common sense, this atmosphere of fear and suspicion is not easy to push back against. That means it would take time. So I'm pretty sure that not only in the media, but also within the political class itself, there will be attempts to push back against any turn or shift in foreign policy of Canada and the Middle East. That's for sure. And I think Minister President Trudeau is aware of that. And I think it would take time for him and for his cabinet to push back against all these prejudices and fear mongering, etc.
Okay.
And only then we can tell how significant is this shift.
Okay.
I think it's too early to say.
Oh, and pushing back on some of that that you mentioned, the fear mongering and so on and so forth, they also have to present alternatives. So what would you recommend that Canada focus on if it truly wants to be less vulnerable in the world?
Right. I think, you see, I use the example of Afghanistan when I used to teach in Germany. When I look at how much NATO states invested in the war in Afghanistan, to occupy Afghanistan, and calculated economically, what if this amount of money was spent, let's say, in supporting farmers in Afghanistan and paying farmers in Afghanistan, let's say, $10 for a kilo of tomato or potatoes, rather than them, the farmers, cultivating opiums and selling them for $10 for the warlords. So if they would have done that, they would have got rid of the opiums and all the drugs and would have introduced development for the Afghani people to, prosperity, welfare, peaceful solution, and development. That would have been the best way to push back against any form of extremism and terror. What they did is quite the opposite. They militarized the conflict, destroyed the country, killed 10,000 of people, and cultivated this indirectly the opium productions, right? The highest in the world. So the same thing we can say here about Canada and the Middle East. If Canada now would engage productively in the conflict with Israel and Palestine and push for a peaceful solution, sustainable and social and just solution in Israel and Palestine, would push for an economic and political development in Iraq to integrate the alienated segment of the Iraqi population into the Iraqi state, would push for a political solution in Syria to create a transition government that will solve the conflict peacefully. I think that's the way to go forward.
All right, Sabah Alnasseri joining us from Toronto. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Jesse.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.